All right, so you sent us this huge pile of documents on this EU proposal about making vehicles more circular.
Yeah.
And wow, there's a lot to go through. Impact assessments and proposals,
Mhm.
even some pretty heated debates. We've really gone through it all.
Yeah.
And today we're going to try to help you understand what's important about all this.
I think a good place to start is that uh, this isn't just about recycling old cars.
Right.
It's really much bigger than that. The EU is trying to change pretty much everything about how vehicles are designed, built, how we use them, even how they're disposed of.
Yeah, we're talking about like requiring a certain amount of recycled material to go into new cars,
Hmm.
giving every car a digital passport,
Yeah.
even rules about how we export used vehicles.
It's a big one.
There's a lot to cover here.
Yeah. And I think to really understand why the EU is doing all of this,
Yeah.
we need to start by looking at their concerns about the environmental impact of vehicles.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue for them. Everything from greenhouse gases
Right.
to the effects of mining all those raw materials we need to build cars.
And this is where it gets real for you.
Right.
Whether you are someone who cares about the environment or just someone who's curious about what cars are going to look like in the future, this regulation, it's going to impact what you see on the roads in the next few years,
Yep.
maybe even impact what you have in your wallet down the line.
It really could. It's all part of a bigger plan, too. The EU, they want to make the automotive industry more circular. It all kind of aligns with their goals in the European Green Deal and this new Circular Economy Action Plan.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of how they plan to do that.
Sure.
One of the key ideas in this proposal is design for circularity.
Right.
What does that actually mean?
I think a good way to think about it is to imagine you're building with Legos,
Okay.
right? You can take them apart and then you build something totally new.
The EU wants cars to be more like that.
Yeah.
Designed so they can be taken apart easily, and then the parts can be reused or recycled.
Okay.
So to make that happen, the proposal sets some specific targets.
Okay.
By a certain date, all new vehicles will need to be 85% recyclable and 95% recoverable by weight.
So they're basically trying to turn cars into like high-tech puzzles.
I like that. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But it doesn't end there. The proposal also has these mandates for using recycled materials in new cars.
Right.
And it's not just a tiny bit, it's a lot.
This was really surprising to me, actually. They're saying that there has to be a certain amount of recycled plastic in every new vehicle.
Yeah.
And they're even saying that some of that plastic has to come specifically from old cars.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there even enough recycled plastic out there to meet that demand?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. It's possible that this push for recycled content could lead to like a huge increase in demand. Maybe it'll even spark new recycling technologies.
Yeah. We'll have to wait and see how the industry adapts.
And it's not even just plastic. The European Commission could set targets for using recycled steel, aluminum, magnesium, even, those important raw materials like what they use in magnets and stuff.
Yeah.
So this is a huge shift in the entire car manufacturing process.
Absolutely. And the EU isn't even just focused on what goes into the car. They're also really worried about what stays out of cars.
Yeah.
So that's where the chemical restrictions come in.
Oh, right. Like making sure there's no lead or mercury, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But this proposal, it seems to go even further.
Yeah, it does. It builds on existing restrictions, but it also gives the commission the power to, restrict other substances
Okay.
that might be problematic for recycling or could pose risks to human health or the environment throughout a car's whole life.
So, but wouldn't that potentially, stifle innovation in materials? Like, what if there's a new material that performs better than, what we use now, but it's harder to recycle? How does the EU balance that?
That's a great point. It's a valid concern. I think finding the right balance between, innovation and environmental protection is going to be one of the key challenges as they start to implement these regulations.
Yeah,
I think the industry will be watching this really closely.
definitely.
Okay, so moving on to something that sounds a little more sci-fi. Let's talk about this digital circularity vehicle passport.
Okay, yeah, I've been kind of wondering about this one. So every car would basically have its own like digital record, right?
Mhm.
What kind of information would be in there?
So it would be a detailed record with information on how to safely remove and replace parts,
Yeah.
including things like batteries and electric motors. It also has details about all the critical raw materials that were used to build the car. That's really important information when it comes to recycling later on.
Right. That makes sense. But these documents also mention something about, having instructions in there on how to handle digitally coded components that could, like, prevent repairs.
Right.
What's that all about?
It's an interesting one. Those digitally coded components, they could be, I don't know, anything from like anti-theft measures
Okay.
to parts that need special software or tools to even access. So the passport would have, the information you need to handle those components safely and properly.
Okay. So it's about transparency and making sure that, the right information is available at every stage of a vehicle's life.
Hmm.
It's interesting to think about how that could affect mechanics,
Yeah.
recyclers, even people who like to work on their own cars.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about giving everyone access to the information they need to deal with these vehicles as they get, more and more complex.
Right.
So speaking of different stages of a vehicle's life, let's talk about what happens when a car reaches like the end of its life.
Okay.
That's where this idea of extended producer resellability comes in.
Right. So the EU is proposing that manufacturers, they have more responsibility
Yeah.
for what happens to their cars, when they're not being driven anymore. But what does that actually mean, like practically?
Well, it means that, instead of just selling cars, the manufacturers would be responsible for setting up or at least participating in systems to collect those cars when they're at the end of their life.
Mm.
They would also be responsible for making sure that those cars are treated properly
Uh-huh.
and for covering the costs of all of those activities.
Okay.
It's a big change from the kind of out of sight, out of mind approach we see a lot of today.
Right. So this could mean that we see more options for, getting rid of our old cars in a way that's, better for the environment.
Yeah,
It's a different way of thinking about it. I'm curious to see how that's going to play out.
me too. It raises a lot of questions, about how manufacturers are going to adapt and what it might mean for the cost of cars.
Mm.
But the EU is sending a pretty clear message. They're serious about this. They want to make the automotive industry more sustainable.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about, designing for circularity, using recycled materials,
Right.
even giving cars digital passports.
Right.
But what about all the cars that just seem to disappear?
Right. Like, what about all the missing vehicles?
Yeah.
I mean, how can they even enforce these rules if they don't know where all the cars are?
Yeah, that's a good question. The EU acknowledges that, this has been a problem. So they're suggesting a pretty smart solution, I think.
Okay.
They want to change how vehicles are registered.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to require people to provide more detailed documentation about why a car's registration is canceled.
So instead of just saying a car was scrapped, you'd have to say if it was exported or stolen or actually recycled?
Exactly.
Okay.
This added transparency would help them keep track of all these vehicles.
Okay.
Make sure they're being, handled correctly.
Right. It's about closing the loop, making sure that no car kind of slips through the cracks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the EU's, efforts to make cars more circular, they don't stop at their own borders, right? They're also looking at how they export used vehicles.
Right. Right. The EU, they don't want to just be exporting their environmental problems to other countries.
Right.
So they've gotten pretty specific about how, used vehicles can be exported.
Yeah, they have. And it all starts with, determining whether a used car can even be exported at all.
Okay.
Remember that two-part assessment we talked about?
Mm-hmm.
That's really important here.
So if a car is already considered end of life in the EU,
Right.
it's not allowed to be exported.
Exactly. But even if a car passes that initial check and it's, considered a used vehicle,
Okay.
there's still more hoops to jump through.
They don't want other countries getting stuck with a bunch of, junkers, right?
That's exactly right. So the EU requires used vehicles to go through like a really thorough roadworthiness check before they can be exported.
And this isn't just like a quick once-over, right?
No.
This has to be done by someone who knows what they're doing
Right.
and who can verify that the car meets, whatever the safety and environmental standards are for the country it's going to.
Absolutely.
They're really trying to make sure that these cars are in good shape.
They are. But even after a car passes the check, the export process isn't over. The EU has this whole system for tracking how these used cars move across borders.
Right. It's all about transparency. They want to know where these cars are going.
Exactly. And it starts with the exporter. They have to notify the authorities in their member state that they want to export the vehicle. And this is more than just a heads up. They have to provide a lot of detailed information
Okay.
about the car, including the VIN, the make and model, the destination country, even who the importer is.
Okay, so it's a lot of paperwork,
It is.
but I guess it makes sense. They want to make sure everything is legitimate.
Exactly. And then once the authorities in the exporting country have that information, they have to pass it on to the authorities in the importing country.
Okay, so everyone's kind of in the loop.
Right.
And then does the importing country get a say in whether they accept the car?
Yes, they do. They have, a chance to object to the export
Okay.
if they have any concerns.
Okay.
Maybe their, safety or environmental standards are stricter, or maybe they think that the car isn't, actually intended to be used on the road,
Okay.
but is instead going to be illegally dismantled or something.
Right. So it's a collaborative process then.
It is. But what about cases where a used car is being exported to a country that doesn't have any agreement with EU about how to manage end-of-life vehicles?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do they make sure those cars don't just get dumped or recycled improperly?
Right.
That's a really good question. The EU has thought about that too.
Okay.
And, they have specific rules in place for those situations.
Okay.
It mainly comes down to financial guarantees.
Okay, so the exporter has to put up some money
Yeah.
to cover the potential costs of dealing with that car at the end of its life, even if that happens outside of the EU.
Precisely.
Okay.
It's like an insurance policy for the environment.
Okay.
Make sure that someone is financially responsible for that car no matter where it ends up. But on top of all the paperwork and financial guarantees, the EU also conducts, actual inspections.
Because seeing is believing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they'll do inspections before the cars are exported. And they also do random checks at border crossings.
All right.
They want to make sure that, the exporters are following the rules
Okay.
and that the cars that are actually being shipped out, meet the standards.
So we've talked about how the EU decides, which cars are considered end of life,
Right.
and we've gone through their system for controlling how used vehicles can be exported.
Mm.
But what about the cars that stay in the EU? What happens to them when they're not roadworthy anymore?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
The EU has these very specific rules about how to handle end-of-life vehicles inside the EU.
Okay.
And it's all about, trying to close the loop and create a circular economy.
So they're trying to make sure that these old cars don't just end up in landfills. They're
Yeah.
trying to get as much value out of them as possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the first step in this process is getting the car, off the road
Okay.
and into the right hands.
Okay, so that's where these authorized treatment facilities come in.
Yes.
The ones we talked about before.
You got it. These are specialized facilities,
Yeah.
and they're licensed to handle end-of-life vehicles in a way that's safe for the environment.
Okay.
They're a key part of this whole circular economy system.
So what actually happens at these facilities? Can you walk me through it?
Sure. So before they can even start working on a car, they have to make sure it's been depolluted.
Depolluted. What does that mean?
It means that they have to remove all the fluids
Okay.
and components that could be harmful, to the environment.
Right.
Things like fuel, oil, coolant, brake fluid, batteries, airbags, anything that could potentially leak or contaminate the environment.
So they're making sure that the car is safe for the environment
Exactly.
before they even do anything else.
Exactly. And this whole depollution process, it has to be done really carefully, following, very strict guidelines. They want to minimize any risk of spills or leaks.
Mm-hmm.
And then all those hazardous materials, they have to be collected and disposed of properly.
Okay.
It's not just a matter of draining the oil and calling it a day.
Right. So it's a very controlled process. What happens after the car has been depolluted?
Well, then comes the dismantling stage.
Yeah.
And this isn't just a random, smash and grab operation.
They're not just taking a sledgehammer to it.
No,
Mhm.
not quite. The EU has very, specific rules about about what parts have to be removed from the car
Okay.
and how those parts need to be handled.
So it's a very methodical process.
It is. And a big part of it is identifying the parts that are most valuable for reuse
Okay.
or remanufacturing or recycling.
So things like batteries, catalytic converters,
Yeah, yeah.
tires, electronic components,
hmm
all that stuff that can be, salvaged and given a second life.
Exactly. And they have to be removed really carefully to make sure that they aren't damaged.
Right. A cracked battery or a dented catalytic converter, that's not going to be very useful.
Exactly. So once those high priority parts are removed, they're sorted and stored. The parts that are in good enough condition can be cleaned up
Okay.
and sold as used parts.
Okay.
Parts that need a little more TLC, can be sent off for remanufacturing.
Okay.
So they get, refurbished basically.
Right.
And then the parts that are really beyond repair,
Mm-hmm.
those can be recycled. That way all those valuable materials, they don't go to waste.
Right. So it's like they're trying to get, every last bit of value out of these cars.
They are. It's all about maximizing resource recovery
Right.
and minimizing the need to dig up more new materials.
Right. Right. Okay, so we've talked about depollution and dismantling.
Right.
What happens to the rest of the car? The stuff that can't be reused or recycled?
Well, that's where the shredding comes in.
Ah, the grand finale.
Exactly. The shell of the car is basically shredded into small pieces.
Okay.
And that makes it easier to separate out all the different materials so they can be recycled.
So they're basically just like turning those old cars into, scrap metal.
Not just metal, they're recovering plastics
Okay.
and other recyclable materials too.
Yeah.
After shredding, all those materials they get processed even further so they can be used to make new products.
So even though that specific car is gone,
Right.
the parts, live on in different forms. I mean, it's kind of cool when you think about it that way.
It is. It's a great example of how, a circular economy is supposed to work.
Yeah.
But the EU regulations don't stop there.
Oh.
They also have rules about how these end-of-life vehicles are collected and transported.
Right. So they're really thinking about every stage of the process.
They are. They want to make sure that these old cars are handled responsibly from, the moment they're taken off the road all the way to when they're recycled. So let's talk about collection. Remember those authorized treatment facilities?
Mm-hmm. The ones that do all the depolluting and the dismantling.
Right. Well, they also have a big role in collecting those end-of-life vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
They work with collection points,
Okay.
scrap yards, garages, even, individuals who have old cars sitting around.
So there's a whole network for getting these cars off the road and to the right place.
Right. And the EU has rules about how those collection points have to operate too. They have to be licensed. They have to follow guidelines for storing vehicles safely.
Yeah.
And they have to make sure that the vehicles are transported to the treatment facility in a way that prevents leaks or spills.
So they're really trying to cover all their bases.
They are. They're trying to create this closed loop system where those old cars are, taken care of responsibly at every stage of the process.
It seems like they've really put a lot of thought into this.
They have. They've developed a really comprehensive system
Yeah.
for managing end-of-life vehicles within the EU.
It's pretty impressive, honestly. It seems like they're really committed to creating a more sustainable future for the automotive industry.
I agree. But, creating these regulations, that's just the first step. Now we have to see how they're actually put into practice.
Right. And that's where things get, even more interesting.
Absolutely.
We've talked a lot about the nuts and bolts of the regulations.
Mm-hmm.
But what does all this mean for the automotive industry as a whole?
Yeah.
What are the potential benefits and challenges that might, come from this big push towards a circular economy?
That's a great question. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in our final segment. So we've talked about how the EU wants to, change the entire life cycle of a vehicle.
Right.
But before we get into what happens, like at the very end, I think it's helpful to understand how the EU actually defines an end-of-life vehicle.
Yeah.
It might not be as as obvious as you might think.
Yeah, you're telling me. I was going through these documents, and it's not just about whether the car runs or not.
Right.
The EU has like a whole system for making that determination.
They do. It's a two-part assessment process.
Okay.
And the first part is all about what they call irreparable damage.
Okay. So under part A of this assessment,
Right.
there's a list of criteria, and if a car meets just one of those criteria, it's automatically labeled end of life.
That's right. And some of them are pretty straightforward.
Okay.
We're talking about cars that have been, cut up or stripped for parts,
Uh-huh.
cars that have been completely burned out,
Yeah.
or even submerged in water, like up to the dashboard.
So if your car looks like it belongs in a Mad Max movie, it's probably reached the end of the line.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
But there's another category under Part A that's called economically irreparable,
Okay.
and this is where things get a little more complicated.
So even if a car is technically fixable, the EU might still say, like, nope, this is end of life if the cost of the repairs is more than the car is worth.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
a very practical way of looking at it. If it just doesn't make financial sense to repair the car,
Yeah.
it makes sense to consider it end of life.
Yeah.
But what's interesting here is that this could actually give, the car owner more say in what happens to their car.
Okay.
If you're willing to pay for the repairs, even if they're, really expensive,
Yeah.
you might be able to keep your car on the road longer.
That's a good point. So it's not just about whether the car can be fixed. It's also about whether it makes sense to fix it.
Right. Exactly. But, what about those cases where a car is damaged, but it's not a clear-cut total loss?
Yeah.
That's where Part B of the assessment comes in.
Okay, so part B, this is for those cars that, they're not totally wrecked, but they're showing some pretty serious warning signs.
Exactly. Think about water damage, but like below the dashboard level,
Okay.
missing doors,
Okay.
fuel leaks,
Okay.
or even like excessively worn brakes or steering.
Okay, so these are cars that you might be able to fix up, but the EU wants to make sure that they can be repaired to a high enough standard.
Right. And that's a key point. In Part B, it's not just about whether the car can be repaired.
Yeah.
It's about whether it can be repaired well enough to pass a roadworthiness test within 2 years.
So even if you think you can patch your car back together, the EU might say, no, if they don't think it'll be safe on the road in the long term.
Exactly. But even if a car does fail this assessment,
Mhm.
and it's labeled end of life,
Right.
there is a possibility to appeal the decision,
Okay.
especially for people who are, really passionate about restoring classic cars.
So there's a loophole for the vintage car enthusiasts.
Well, I don't know if it's a loophole exactly.
Okay.
The owner would have to, submit a very detailed restoration plan to the authorities.
Okay.
Really demonstrate that they have the technical and financial ability to restore the car
Okay.
to a condition that meets the EU's, roadworthiness standards.
So it's not just about, having a dream and a wrench.
Right.
You'd really have to prove that you're serious about the restoration and that you can do it, properly. It's interesting to see how the EU tries to balance, these safety and environmental concerns with the desires of, car enthusiasts.
It is, and I think it's important to remember that these assessments, they aren't happening in a vacuum.
Hmm.
There are real people involved in making these decisions, and those decisions can have a big impact on people's lives.
Definitely. I mean, imagine you're in an accident and your car is like totaled by the insurance company.
Right.
I mean, that's already a stressful situation.
Yeah.
And then to have to go through this whole end of life assessment on top of that.
Yeah, it's a lot to deal with.
It just it shows, the human element in all of this. We're talking about these regulations that are supposed to, make things more sustainable.
Right.
But we have to, think about how they affect individuals too.
Absolutely. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about how these regulations work when cars leave the EU.
Okay, right. The EU, they don't want to just be exporting, their environmental problems to other countries.
Right.
So they've gotten really specific about how used vehicles can be exported.
They have. And it really starts with, figuring out whether a used car is even eligible for export in the first place.
Okay.
Remember that two-part assessment we talked about?
Uh-huh.
That's key here.
Okay, so if a car is already considered end of life in the EU,
Right.
it can't be exported.
Exactly. But even if a car, passes that first check and it's considered a used vehicle,
Okay.
there are still more things they have to do.
They don't want other countries to be getting, stuck with a bunch of clunkers.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So the EU requires that used vehicles go through, a really thorough roadworthiness check before they can be exported.
And this isn't just like, a quick glance over, right?
Right.
This check, it has to be done by a qualified professional,
Right.
someone who can really verify that the car, meets the safety and environmental standards of the country it's being sent to.
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
really trying to make sure these cars are in good shape.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
But even after a car passes that check, the export process isn't over.
Oh.
The EU has this whole system for keeping track of how used cars move across borders.
Right. It's all about transparency. They want to know where these cars are going.
Exactly. And it starts with the exporter.
Okay.
They have to notify the authorities in their member state
Okay.
that they want to export the vehicle.
Right.
And this isn't just, a casual, hey, FYI.
Yeah.
They have to provide like very detailed information about the car,
Okay.
including, the VIN, the make and model, the destination country, even who the importer is.
Wow, that's a lot of paperwork.
It is.
But it does make sense.
Yeah.
They want to make sure that everything's, above board.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then once the authorities in the exporting country have that information, they have to, pass it on to the authorities in the importing country.
Right. So everyone's in the loop.
Everyone's on the same page.
So does the importing country then get to say whether or not they'll accept the car?
They do. Yeah, they have the opportunity to object to the export if they have any concerns.
Okay.
Maybe their safety or environmental standards are stricter,
Okay.
or maybe they have reason to believe that the car, isn't really intended for continued use,
Right.
but is instead, going to be illegally dismantled or something.
So it's a collaborative process.
Yeah, it is. But what about those situations where a used car is being exported to a country that doesn't have an agreement with the EU
Right.
about how to manage end-of-life vehicles?
Yeah, how do they make sure that those cars don't end up, being dumped or recycled, improperly?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the EU has thought about that too.
Okay.
They have specific rules for those cases.
Okay.
And it mainly comes down to financial guarantees.
So the exporter has to like put up some money
Yeah.
to cover the potential cost of dealing with that car at the end of its life, even if that happens outside of the EU?
Exactly.
Okay.
Have like it's like an insurance policy
Okay.
for the environment.
Okay.
It ensures that someone is financially responsible for that car, no matter where it ends up. But on top of all the paperwork and financial guarantees, the EU also does actual inspections.
Because seeing is believing, right?
Exactly. They do pre-export inspections, and they also do random checks at border crossings. They're making sure that exporters are following the rules, and that the cars that are being shipped out actually meet the standards.
So we've talked about how the EU decides which cars are, end of life.
Right.
And we've explored their system for controlling how used cars can be exported.
Yeah.
But what about the cars that do stay in the EU?
Yeah.
What happens to them when they're, no longer roadworthy?
That's where things get really interesting. The EU has very, very specific rules about how to manage these end-of-life vehicles inside their borders.
Okay.
And it's all about closing the loop.
Okay.
And really creating that circular economy.
So they're trying to make sure that these old cars don't just end up in landfills.
Right.
They're trying to recover as much value from them as possible.
Exactly. And the first step is getting those cars off the road
Okay.
and into the right hands.
Okay, so this is where those authorized treatment facilities come in, right?
Yeah.
This is the ones that we talked about before.
You got it. These are they're specialized facilities,
Okay.
and they're licensed to handle end-of-life vehicles
Okay.
in a way that's environmentally sound.
Huh.
They're a really key part of this whole circular economy system.
So what actually happens at these authorized treatment facilities? Can you like walk me through the process?
Sure. So uh, before they can even start working on a car, they have to make sure that it's been depolluted.
Depolluted. What does that mean?
It basically means removing any fluids or components
Okay.
that could be harmful to the environment.
Okay.
So things like fuel, oil, coolant, brake fluid, batteries, airbags, anything that could potentially leak or contaminate.
Okay, so they're basically just making sure that the car is environmentally safe before they go any further.
Exactly.
Uh,
And this whole depollution process, it has to be done very, very carefully. Following these very strict guidelines.
yeah.
They want to minimize any risk of spills or leaks.
Mhm.
And then all those, hazardous materials, they have to be collected and disposed of properly.
Okay.
It's not just a matter of, draining the oil and calling it a day.
Right, right. It's a very, very controlled process.
Yeah.
So, what happens after the car has been depolluted?
Well, then comes the dismantling stage.
Okay.
And this isn't just, some random smash and grab operation.
They're not just like taking a sledgehammer to it.
No, not exactly. The EU has very, very specific rules
Yeah.
about which parts have to be removed from the car
Okay.
and how those parts need to be handled.
So it's a methodical process.
It is, and a big part of it is identifying those parts that are the most valuable for reuse
Okay.
or remanufacturing or recycling.
So things like batteries, catalytic converters,
Yeah.
tires, electronic components, all that stuff that can be salvaged and given a second life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they have to be removed very carefully to make sure that they aren't damaged.
Right. A cracked battery or a dented catalytic converter, that's not going to be very useful.
Exactly. So once those high priority parts have been removed, they're sorted and stored. Parts that are in good enough condition can be cleaned up and sold as used parts. Parts that need a little more work can be sent off for remanufacturing.
Okay.
Basically they're refurbished.
Right.
And then the parts that are just beyond repair, those can be recycled so that all those, those valuable materials they don't go to waste.
So it's like they're really trying to get, every last bit of value out of these cars.
They are. It's all about maximizing resource recovery.
Okay.
And minimizing the need to go and extract more, virgin materials.
Right. Right. Okay, so we've talked about depollution and dismantling.
Right.
What happens to the rest of the car, the stuff that can't be reused or recycled?
Well, that's where the shredding comes in.
Ah, the grand finale.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The shell of the car is basically shredded into small pieces,
Okay.
and that makes it easier to separate the different materials for recycling.
So they're basically just like turning those old cars into, scrap metal at that point.
Not just metal, they're recovering plastics
Okay.
and other recyclable materials too.
Yeah.
After the shredding, all those different materials, they get processed even further.
Okay.
So they can be used to make new products.
So even though that specific car is gone, its parts live on in different forms. I mean, that's kind of cool when you think about it like that.
It is. It's a great example of how a circular economy is supposed to work.
Yeah.
But the EU regulations don't stop there. They also have rules about how end-of-life vehicles are collected and transported.
Right. So they're really thinking about every stage of the process here.
They are. They want to make sure that those old cars are handled responsibly
Right.
from the moment they're taken off the road all the way to when they're finally recycled.
Okay.
So let's talk about collection.
Okay.
Remember those authorized treatment facilities?
Mm-hmm. The ones that do all the depolluting and the dismantling.
Right. Well, they also play a really big role in collecting these end-of-life vehicles. They work with collection points,
Okay.
scrap yards, garages, even individuals who have old cars just sitting around.
So there's a whole network
Yeah, there is.
for getting those cars off the road and to the right place.
Yeah, that's right. And the EU has has rules about how those collection points have to operate too.
Oh, okay.
They have to be licensed.
Okay.
They have to follow, guidelines for storing the vehicles safely,
Okay.
and they have to make sure that the vehicles are transported to the treatment facility in a way that prevents, leaks or spills.
So they're trying to cover all their bases?
They are. They're
Yeah.
they're really trying to create this closed loop system
Right.
where those old cars are managed, responsibly at every step of the way.
It seems like they've really put a lot of thought into this.
Yeah, they have. They've developed a very, very comprehensive system for managing end-of-life vehicles within the EU.
It's pretty impressive, honestly. It seems like they're really committed to creating a more sustainable future for the automotive industry.
Yeah, I agree. But creating the regulations, that's just the first step. Now we have to see how they're actually implemented and what kind of impact they actually have.
Right, and that's where things get even more interesting.
Absolutely.
We've talked a lot about, the details of the regulations, but what does this all mean for the automotive industry as a whole?
Yeah.
What are the potential, benefits and challenges that might come up from this, big push towards a circular economy?
That's a great question. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in our final segment.
So we've gone through this whole plan that the EU has for making the life cycle of vehicles more circular.
Yeah.
From design all the way to disposal.
Right.
And even, what happens when those vehicles cross borders.
It's a big change. And I think, one of the most interesting impacts of these regulations is how it could change the whole mindset of the automotive industry.
Yeah, right now it feels like everything's about selling new cars,
Right.
but these circularity measures would kind of force manufacturers to think, more long term.
Exactly. It's about moving away from that take, make, dispose model.
Right.
And really embracing a more sustainable approach where we, reduce, reuse, recycle as much as possible.
And that could lead to some really interesting innovations in how cars are designed and built, right?
Yeah.
Like what if we had cars with modular components that could be easily, swapped out and upgraded?
That's a great idea. It would mean that you could keep your car for much longer.
Yeah.
And just upgrade it over time instead of having to buy a whole new one every few years.
And think about how that would change the used car market.
Yeah.
If cars were designed to last longer and be more easily repaired, used cars would be a much better investment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You could really disrupt that
Yeah.
that cycle of constant consumption.
Yeah.
And lead to a much more sustainable system overall. But like with any big shift, there are going to be challenges along the way.
Like what kind of challenges?
Well, one of the biggest ones will be making sure that there's enough recycled material to meet the demand.
Right, because if all the car manufacturers are suddenly required to use a certain percentage of recycled steel, recycled aluminum,
Yeah.
I mean the prices for those materials are going to go up.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that could make it harder for manufacturers to keep costs down.
Right.
And it could even potentially slow down the transition to electric vehicles if they need those materials for batteries.
So it sounds like there's a real need for more innovation in the recycling industry.
Absolutely. The EU is hoping that these regulations will encourage new investment in recycling technologies
Okay.
to make it easier and cheaper to recover those valuable materials from these end-of-life vehicles.
It makes you wonder if this could lead to like a boom in green technology.
It very well could, and that would mean new jobs,
Yeah.
new opportunities. It's a win-win for the economy and the environment. But at the end of the day, I think the big question is: will these regulations actually reduce the environmental impact of the automotive industry?
Right.
The EU has done a lot of research.
Okay.
And they believe that these regulations will lead to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions
Okay.
and resource consumption. But we have to remember that these are long-term goals.
Right.
It's going to take some time to see the full effects.
A marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And who knows, what kind of twists and turns might happen along the way. But one thing is certain: the EU is taking a bold step towards a more sustainable future
Yeah.
for the automotive industry.
It's really fascinating to see how this is going to play out, and it'll be interesting to see if other countries, follow their lead.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
we're left with a question for you to think about.
Mm.
Is this the beginning of a global shift towards a more sustainable way of making and using cars?
Yeah, will we see a future where vehicles are designed to last longer and be easily repaired and ultimately, be recycled back into the system?
Right. Only time will tell.
Right.
But one thing is for sure that the conversation about circularity
Yeah.
has begun.
And that's what makes this such an exciting time to be following the automotive industry.
Absolutely.
We hope that this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead,
Yeah.
and that you feel empowered to participate in this really important conversation about the future of transportation.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the EU's circular vehicles proposal.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.